I am a small gangster. My boss tried to rob a cool and beautiful man, but was rejected and became angry and humiliated. He pointed at me and threatened the beauty. If you reject me again, I will let this kind of person abuse you. The beauty vomited blood stubbornly. Okay, come on. Me, huh? No, don't come over here. I'm straight. Has anyone considered my feelings? 1. I took a desperate puff of my cigarette, my face pale and solemn. My colleague patted my shoulder and said sympathetically, "Go in first. If you're late, the boss will get angry with you too." I had no choice but to walk into the dark room in despair. The man Robert had robbed had his hands shackled behind his back and was kneeling on the ground, his back still straight. She was a beauty, and the blood on her lips was the mark left by her desperate attempt to bite the boss's ear. He narrowed his eyes and stared at me coldly and sharply. I wish I could tear me into pieces and eat me. I locked the door. With a bang, all the noise was shut off. With the last bit of luck, she mustered up the courage to look at him again. He is tall, with broad shoulders, narrow waist, long legs, and flat chest. Although he looks beautiful, his facial features are tough and he looks like a man in every way. I became even more depressed. My fingers were itching, so I took out another cigarette, put it to my lips, and walked over. He looked up expressionlessly. "If you're going to do it quickly, idiot. TSK. I slapped him in the face, neither too hard nor too soft. "Hey, keep your mouth shut." I took a puff of cigarette and sighed. "Will it scream?" "What? Forget it." I closed my eyes, recalled the gay video I just watched, and hummed a few times in imitation. This was the first time I did this, and in front of a strange man. It's very embarrassing to have to bite the bullet. The man suddenly became quiet, so that in the dark room the only sound was his own strange and charming breathing that spread with the smoke. These were definitely the most deadly 3 minutes of my gangster life. I really can't stand it. I would rather bear the infamy of being a quickie and end it quickly. A hesitant and shallow gasp came in. His voice is even more charming, just like a professional male voice actor. Slow, powerful subwoofer. My groan paused, then suddenly became shrill. The atmosphere was weird and a little off, as if I was the one down there. The man lowered his eyes and whispered, "Give me a cigarette." I put one in his mouth. He stared at me intently, then suddenly opened his mouth slightly and bit the cigarette hard with his canine teeth. He put the tip of his tongue against the cigarette holder, raised his chin, and touched the cigarette butt to my cigarette. The fire started. Reflected in the black eyes, there is a hint of orange light. He said, "Thank you." He moved so quickly that I didn't have time to react before he touched the cigarette butt. I jumped away immediately and subconsciously frowned in disgust. He saw it, but I didn't want to apologize. What a psycho. A grown man lighting a cigarette is so disgusting. I said calmly, "It's okay. Just don't tell anyone." Before leaving, I remembered something, turned around and kicked him in the butt twice. Afterwards, my colleague really praised me. "You did a good job, bro. You bullied that kid so much that he has to limp now." I hide my achievements and fame. 2. The beauty seemed not as stubborn as before, and was even willing to talk to the boss a few more words. The eldest brother was very happy and decided to give him some advice and go out to buy some clothes. Of course, his subordinates have to watch over him. This job was none of my business as I was busy leading my brothers to seize the territory in Silver Lobby Bay. Halfway through the cut, I received a phone call. My colleague asked me to hurry over because there was urgent work. I didn't have time to change my clothes, so I put a gun on my waist, drove my car, wore that black suit, and rushed to the mall with half my face covered in blood. The beauty is still the same beauty. He was just wearing a white shirt and linen trousers, and he stood there coldly with a tall and slender figure. After washing and dressing up, she looks like a polished jade, gorgeous and almost enchanting. My colleague pushed me and said, "He has upset the boss again. You should go now. The first time is the last time." I was desperate. "Why, colleague? Among us, you are the only one with dyed yellow hair. You look the most like a gangster. If you don't go, who will? Over there, The boss shouted angrily, "Thomas, I'm going to ask you one last time. Do you want to wear it or not?" It was a black gauze top. The fabric was almost transparent and full of holes. The beauty sneered viciously, "Robert, don't you know some dirty tricks to humiliate me? I tell you, I won't wear it, even if I die." Before I could finish my words, he rushed towards me, pushed me to the ground, sat on me, took my gun and tried to shoot himself in the head. I was scared to death. "You are sick. What does it have to do with me?" I quickly hugged him and whispered, "Don't be stubborn. Just give in and I'll take off my clothes and put them on you. Okay?" Thomas didn't say anything. I was afraid that the eldest brother would ask me to rough him again. So when I helped him up, I used all my strength to coax him, wishing I could treat him as my dad. He finally picked up the clothes with a cold face. When we went out, the boss took a look at my suit covering Thomas. He didn't pursue it. Having worked under him for a long time, I also understand that Robert sometimes just cares about his reputation and is willing to give Thomas a way out. Thomas is young and doesn't understand this. But speaking of it, I do admire Thomas. He is a man who will never give in, even if he dies. I feel the same way. A man like this must be a pitiful straight man. But that night, Thomas was sent to my room again. This time I'm going to waste his entire night. What the boss meant was that the effect last time was good, but it wore off quickly. He told you to disgust Thomas more so that he would understand the boss's goodness. My father. 3. Thomas sat at the head of my bed, still wrapped in my suit. Me. Remember to return my clothes to me. Thomas stared at me sullenly and slowly took off his suit. There was nothing inside. I turned my head away and said, "I'll find you some pajamas to wear. You go to sleep first." He was stunned for a moment, but his expression was still not good. "It's okay. I admit it, just do it." There was contempt on his face, as if he believed that with that face, everyone was bound to be attracted to him and go crazy for him. So the outcome is good or bad. It's just a matter of Robert robbing me, or just sleeping with me a few times like this. But what does it have to do with me whether you recognize it or not? Am I a passerby who randomly appears as the protagonist of a rag in a post? I don't care about meat or vegetables. I said expressionlessly, "No need." He pinched the corner of the quilt tightly. "We have to do it for real once." I was annoyed. "I can't get hard with you." Thomas was stunned. "What?" I was about to explain when my spare phone vibrated. I turned around quickly. "Who's calling?" I thought about it and lied. "Girlfriend." For some reason, out of the corner of my eye, I saw that Thomas's expression froze and his brows frowned quickly. But I immediately put it out of my mind and waited until I got to the balcony, closing the door to make sure no one was eavesdropping. I answered. The person on the other end of the phone? "Sir, the fish have been received. When will the next batch of fish be caught?" "Richard, the net was closed successfully. When will Robert place the next batch of goods?" I quickly sorted out the code in my mind and replied in the same code. After the call, Thomas had already fallen asleep. Before he was kidnapped, he must have been used to being pampered, so he habitually slept in the middle of the bed. If I slept on the bed, I could only sleep leaning against him. I turned off the lights and had no intention of getting close to him. I leaned against the sofa with half of my body resting on the floor and managed to fall asleep. In a daze, I felt someone picked me up and threw me onto the bed. The hot chest pressed against me. This question seemed to have tortured him for half the night, and he finally asked it out of patience. I heard it was clearly a man's voice. "Is it your boyfriend? You two talk a lot." Thomas grabbed my neck like a madman. His cheekbones turned red with anger, his fingers trembled, and he looked as fragile as a beauty lamp. "So you just dislike me being dirty? That's why you don't sleep with me? Why do you, a gangster, look down on me? No one has ever looked down on me since I was a child." For Thomas persisted. His eyes were fixed on me, our foreheads pressed together, pupils staring into each other's. "You have." I was about to burst into a curse, but then I froze. In the darkness, I could feel his heavy breathing and rapid heartbeat, and his whole body was shaking like a leaf in the wind. He was stressed. I have seen similar reactions in some victims. Although I didn't quite understand why he was so stressed, I subconsciously patted his shoulder with my palm. I don't hate you, I just… In desperation, I had no choice but to continue with the lie I had told before. I just don't want to betray my boyfriend. Thomas's breathing hitched for a moment. His face froze, and complex emotions flashed across his eyes. I said, "By the way, don't tell anyone else that I have a boyfriend. Once a lie begins, it becomes very easy to continue. You know, I have many enemies in this line of work. I'm afraid of getting him into trouble, so I haven't mentioned him to anyone. After working for a few more years and saving enough money, I'll quit and live a good life with him." Thomas finally let go of my collar. He sat silently beside the bed, listening, his entire face shrouded in shadow. A little bit of subtle jealousy grows secretly in an unknown form, but there is no name or qualification to express it. He stared at me and said quietly, "You are good at protecting people." I nodded, feeling uncomfortable being so close to him, so I pushed him away and stood up. He didn't hold back, and when I pushed him, he fell limply onto the quilt like a corpse, staring at me with sidelong eyes. For the moonlight shone on Thomas's brow, his eyes were bloodshot, and I didn't know what he was staring at me for. It's extremely gorgeous, a face that should only be seen on the silver screen, sad and stubborn, mixed with embarrassment and shame. I turned my head away and dared not sleep again. Just go out. Downstairs, a colleague was standing at the door keeping watch. He glanced at me, and I squatted beside him irritably and lit a cigarette. My colleagues felt the same way, probably because they were afraid that if one of them fell, the other would suffer. So they squatted down to encourage me. "Keep working hard. You'll get through this in a blink of an eye. Let me tell you, Robert is a civilized man. That Big D is the one who doesn't treat people as human beings. He caught a man and forced his subordinates to stab him one by one. It's disgusting. Not only did they have to be watched by him, but also by their colleagues. Some of those with poor psychological quality ran away. Damn, where are there so many gay men in the world?" I took a long drag on my cigarette. "Big D was shot last month." "I know. I'm telling you in private, I think the police did a really good job in this matter. Okay, let's not talk about this anymore. Anyway, we all suffer from lack of education, and we can only do this job to make a living. There's nothing we can do about it." I changed the subject. "How did he get here?" "Thomas has actually been here for almost a year, but I never asked about him. Because, as an undercover agent, if you turn a blind eye and deliberately ignore some private matters, your conscience will not be able to bear it and you will not be able to sleep." But, for some unknown reason, I suddenly remembered those red eyes and spoke. The colleague scratched his head and said, "How could you not know? That guy was causing a lot of trouble." He nodded and recounted. Thomas was a well-known top student back then. He studied medicine at the University of Hong Kong. If he could finish his studies, he would definitely be a social elite. But he was unlucky and went to Robert's KTV during his class reunion the first year. Robert took a fancy to him, but Robert didn't care about the flowers of the motherland and the elites. He just drugged him. But the boy was even more ruthless. He smashed his head with a bottle and managed to overcome the effects of the drug. I frowned and interrupted. "Doesn't his family care?" "Colleague. His mother died early, his father was a gambler, and he had a grandmother who went crazy a long time ago. She kept saying that her grandson had a brain disease and could only be cured by praying to the gods. Robert gave him some money and sent him away. His father was even funnier. When he found out that he could be paid, he took the initiative to cover up for Robert." I smoked another cigarette. The colleague sighed. "It's been almost a year, and he still cuts his wrists, jumps off buildings, hits his head against walls, and cuts his face when Robert touches him. If he doesn't have a knife, he steals Robert's. If Robert doesn't have a knife, he beats him. It's too much." A colleague sighed. "Robert had no intention of giving up, but everything else was fine except his face. That face was just too perfect. Who would want him to cut it off? So, he had no choice but to ask his subordinates to destroy it." Colleagues were numb and cold. After playing it too much, they no longer resisted that kind of thing. It's like their spines were pulled out. They can only become limp fish, begging to be fed. I tried hard to control my facial expression. I felt a chill on my back. The colleague also realized that the atmosphere had cooled. He half-jokingly said, "But you are lucky. You have done Robert a favor. I think you will be able to stay with the Emperor for a long time in the future and understand his will. You don't have to run around outside to do dirty work anymore." My heart skipped a beat. That's the truth. Then I won't know when Robert's next batch of goods will be shipped? No, I have to find a way to make him demote me again. 5. When I got home early in the morning, Thomas was sitting upright beside my bed, not wearing any clothes. He stared at me expressionlessly. "Take your suit back. I have nothing to wear." I said, Perhaps because of his background, I became more patient and tolerant towards him. I found a shirt and found that his shoulders were wider than mine, which made the shoulder line look very tight. I frowned. "Wait a minute. There's a bigger shirt. I'll look for it." Thomas said shockingly, "Your husband's." I got goosebumps when I heard that. Why is he my husband? How can you talk like that? For some reason, his face brightened slightly. When I took Thomas to Robert, I advised him, "Don't be too stubborn. You will suffer the consequences. Be more gentle and endure less. If you really can't do anything, then—" I spoke hesitantly. If someone like me were to meet Robert, I would probably bite the bullet and take the shot from him in order to survive. After all, apart from life and death, nothing else matters. But, as expected, Thomas said calmly, "Impossible. There's no difference between me and Robert. Just bear with it for now. I'll be able to rescue you soon." He interrupted me. "There is a difference." He glanced at me and said, "You are honest." Why does it sound like an insult? But I had to give up persuading him. Robert waited for a long time, drinking tea, and asked calmly, "Are you fed?" Thomas stared at him coldly. I quickly pulled his sleeve, and he pursed his lips and nodded. But our little trick did not escape Robert's eyes. "Alan, come here. Let me ask you something." As soon as I walked over, Robert slapped me lightly and asked, "How does he feel?" I quickly knelt down. "Robert, I have absolutely no other thoughts. I will do whatever you ask me to do." Robert knocked for a while, and then he was satisfied. "Thomas, come here and kiss me." Thomas stood still, his fists clenched. I quickly glanced at him and told myself 1,000 times to mind my own business. But when he picked up the ashtray on the table and hit himself on the head, I couldn't help myself and snatched it away. I put on a humble and flattering smile. "Robert, he still has a temper. How about letting me take care of him for a few days?" As soon as these words came out, Robert's already unhappy expression became even gloomier. Robert suddenly laughed nervously, picked up a figurine and smashed it on my head. "You are fucking addicted to playing? You dare to steal my man?" I knelt down, bleeding profusely, and stood in front of Thomas. "No, I'll just take him for a few days." Another smash. "Robert, believe me, I really want him to soften his temper. Do you take me for an idiot?" My eyelids were covered in blood and I couldn't see clearly at all. I sighed inwardly. I am the idiot. Just because of the white scars on Jiang Zhihui's wrists, I couldn't help but want to protect him for a few days. "Robert, considering that I risked my life for you, I really have no selfish motives. Believe me." I tried my best to argue. A colleague who was on good terms with him couldn't stand it. "Robert, didn't Shanji bring you 2 boys yesterday? Anyway, you've been busy trying new things these days. Why don't you let Alan try?" Robert stared at me, smashed the ashtray to the ground, and suddenly pulled my hair up and lifted my face. The thick black blood stains my hair. He chuckled. "Who dyed your hair that ugly color? I just realized that you are actually pretty." He pinched my neck and kissed me without saying anything. It's a disgusting feeling. After the kiss, Robert stared at my pants without any reaction. "I still don't like men." He then let go with satisfaction. "Okay, then you can take care of him for a few days." I stood up trembling, bowed and thanked him. Robert waved his hand. "By the way, why didn't you take the land? I heard that you deserted the battlefield." That won't do. We have rewards and punishments. Alan, even though you have followed me for so many years, if you do something wrong, you still have to do the dirty work. Understand? I nodded. There is no excuse, because this is Robert's way of venting his frustration. And my plan worked. I angered him, got demoted, and saved Thomas in the process. I'm so awesome. As soon as we went out, Thomas hugged me tightly. I couldn't push him away, so I just gave up. I feel dizzy and can't walk. Thomas carried me back to the room. My blood was all over him, and we both looked equally miserable. My colleagues were afraid that Thomas was going to kill me because I had abused him, so they took turns spying on me. When I woke up, a colleague told me that he heard Thomas crying secretly. That kid never cried, even when he heard that his father sold him out. It's really strange, said a colleague. I am speechless. My colleague poked me on the head and said, "You're done." Me, how am I done? I just cried. Good brothers will cry too. I will be touched when I hear good brothers crying for me. How am I done? It's normal. Okay? The colleague was stunned for a moment and explained very slowly. I mean, you are done. Robert asked you to dye your beloved yellow hair black. What are you talking about? Me, it's okay. 6. I dyed my hair yellow not because I love it, but simply because I wanted to look more like a gangster. After dyeing my hair and eyebrows black, I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a little inexplicably uncomfortable. The person in the mirror, with black hair and black eyes, revealed the uprightness hidden in his bones, and even his bone structure became much clearer. People are indeed more energetic. It looks very good. A cold compliment came from behind me. Thomas folded his arms and looked at me gently. I turned my eyes away. I'm a straight man, and I don't do that kind of thing where you look at each other passionately. Let's go. The dirty work that was assigned to us was indeed related to transporting goods. I drove a few small loads, not wanting to alert the enemy, just waiting for Robert to relax so that we could catch the biggest fish. When delivering goods, Thomas sometimes followed us and sometimes rested in the room. I installed a computer for him to pass the time. Away from Robert, he seemed to regard my room as a Garden of Eden where he could rest for a while. His originally alert and fragile expression suddenly relaxed, and he finally gained 2 or 3 pounds. He looks much healthier than the ridged cheekbones he had when I first met him. It's just that my lifestyle isn't very healthy. She always likes to pile my clothes on the bed and cover herself with them when I'm not around, making the bed a mess. When asked, he opened his sleepy eyes and said innocently, "I'm cold, but God has mercy on us. This city surrounded by the sea has just entered winter. How could it be so cold?" But I had no choice but to curse and buy him 2 more quilts. As I folded the clothes back into the closet, Thomas lay quietly on the bed, looking at me and chatting about random things. "Why are you wearing such old-fashioned clothes? Will your boyfriend like it? Doesn't he buy you couple clothes? Alan, what's your real name?" I stopped, turned around, hesitated, and whispered, "Daniel, Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." He stared at the ceiling and repeated it many times. In the end, for some reason, it became Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. "Thomas, Daniel, do you think I'm shady?" He looked at me solemnly, his eyes no longer having the clarity that should be there for someone his age. I didn't lie. I just comforted him. "Why do you think about these things? You have been through so much. It is inevitable that you will mature a little bit. Thomas, you have a boyfriend, and I'm still relying on you. Don't you think I have any dark thoughts? Don't you think your boyfriend would mind? This involves my lack of knowledge, and I have never dated anyone. If my future partner shelters a poor child while he is working, I don't think there is any problem. As for Thomas's behavior, I think he is just a little helpless, mistaking gratitude for help for love. It will be fine after he is rescued and sees the colorful world." So I shook my head and said, "No, we didn't do anything. We have a clear conscience." Thomas stared at me for a long time, seeming to want to say something but stopping himself. Finally, he whispered, "I want to make it clear to you. I never let him touch me. I am clean. Please don't look down on me." "What does this have to do with me?" My words were interrupted. "Thomas, Daniel, Please don't blame me too much. I have been unlucky since I was a child. When people are unlucky, they tend to become gloomy and do extreme things. Please understand me. I didn't understand why he suddenly brought up this topic, so I nodded in confusion. Afterwards, I suddenly realized that every word he said was a prelude to everything and a disclaimer he wrote for himself. The net was about to be closed, and I became busier and busier. The contact person set up a base to arrange the deployment. The telephone is naturally less useful. Thomas once asked me casually, "Why haven't you been talking to your boyfriend on the phone recently?" I haven't figured out a reason yet. He asked casually, "Break up?" "No." "Oh." He flipped the page of the magazine very loudly. Baffling. I didn't have time to pay attention to him because my phone was vibrating. The code translates to Jinghu Hotel 302. Routine. As usual, I said hello and left in a hurry. The rest of my colleagues thought I was going to see the shampoo girl again. They made faces at me, and I felt that my reputation was becoming increasingly tarnished. Inside the hotel, David and John held their computers and we discussed some delivery details in detail. "Richard, the amount this time is huge. Robert will definitely be convicted. Everything will be over soon." I nodded. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. The three of us became alert and looked at each other silently. John hid in the closet, and David had nowhere to hide, so he could only squat behind the curtains. I glanced through the peephole and opened the door with a frown. "Thomas." Thomas's cheekbones had an urgent and nervous redness, as if he knew some secret. He strode in and said coldly to the person behind the curtain, "Stop hiding. What are you doing here?" I stopped him. "You haven't looked for a shampoo girl these days. You've been secretly meeting your boyfriend, right?" Thomas asked. I paused, and David came out blankly from behind the curtain. I gave him a look, and he gritted his teeth and had to hold my hand. Thomas's eyes suddenly became sharp and he looked around deeply. David has an average appearance and average height, making him a perfect candidate for lurking. Thomas's eyes suddenly trembled, and the jealousy and misunderstanding in his eyes became more complicated. "Thomas, since you know this, please give us some space. Listen to me. I saw a man come in with him and he was hiding here. Your boyfriend is cheating on you," Thomas accused. His handsome eyes turned slightly and stared sharply at the closet. "Your boyfriend has someone else outside. He doesn't really love you at all." He moved very quickly and opened the wardrobe. My scalp was tingling and I didn't want the situation to escalate. Bang! I pressed the cabinet door hard with my hand, trying my best to put on a cold expression. "Thomas, that's enough." 7. Thomas froze, and it took him a few seconds to realize that I was stopping him. His chest heaved violently and he was shaking with anger. He stared at me with red eyes. "There is someone inside. Believe me," David responded very quickly, patting my shoulder and saying in a pretentious tone, "Honey, please say something. Look at him. Why is he like this?" "David, not every gay man has to talk like this. Okay." The two top-notch people in front and behind me are giving me more and more headaches. I just want to get this over with quickly. "Thomas, go back." "No," Thomas said in disbelief. "You are still protecting him even at this point. What's so good about him? Why can't you?" He gritted his teeth in despair, suppressed his emotions, lowered his head, and acted like a spoiled child as usual. "Daniel, please, trust me. Open the door." "Thomas, this is my business. I say it again, go back. You are different from me. If you disappear for too long, they will come looking for you." He felt extremely uncomfortable. His brows were tightly furrowed, staring at my unmoved face, tears oozing out viciously. It was like being in a nightmare, on the verge of collapse. After a long silence, his clever mind finally figured it out, or rather, he finally dared to admit the guess. "You knew there was someone inside," he accused, "and you still protected him. Well, I have become a cuckolded scumbag again, and my reputation is even more filthy." David patted my shoulder comfortingly. This action seemed to irritate Thomas's eyes. He glared at David, feeling jealous so much that he wanted to burst out of his chest. but he had no reason to vent it. He glared at him cowardly and extreme, and finally couldn't hold back a line of tears. Why? He muttered to himself. Why should a jerk like you get love? He was trembling. His voice became sharp and pitiful, and he hugged himself tightly like a little madman, hating the whole world. I didn't do anything wrong. Why did God treat me like this? I clenched my fists. Thomas lowered his head, didn't look at me again, and hurried away. After he left, he never came back. His colleagues said that he went back to Robert's place. I smoked a cigarette and felt inexplicably irritated. My colleagues congratulated me. We can finally do what the little hooligans are supposed to do. For some reason, I couldn't say I was happy or relaxed. Perhaps it was simply because he resolutely gave up the blessing I had earned with my bloodshed. Even if you are a good person who does not ask for anything in return, you can't help but feel a little cold-hearted. But maybe there are more emotions hidden inside that I can't even explain. Robert was very cautious about the transaction and delayed making arrangements. I stayed at the port, waiting for instructions, getting a little impatient. I heard from my colleagues that Thomas became Robert's adopted son. My colleagues looked at me in surprise. What are you doing? This is a good thing. No matter how they mess around in private, at least they have to put on a show and stop outsiders like us from picking on them. How great! I took a long drag on my cigarette. Cigarette butts flicker. Suddenly I remembered the pair of stubborn and indifferent eyes of that man when he looked up to light a cigarette. It felt like countless little bugs were gnawing at my flesh, making me feel sore and uncomfortable. Fuck! I cursed under my breath. During Christmas, my colleagues and I went back to Robert's villa. It's like an annual meeting. I saw Thomas again. He was standing behind Robert. His expression was very indifferent, and there was even a hint of cruelty in his words and actions. Our eyes met inadvertently, and he looked away indifferently. Robert saw me and smiled. Alan, you have done a good job these few times. Thank you for your hard work. Thomas, give him a toast and let's put aside our grudges together. Thomas handed me the glass, our fingertips touching. I drank the wine in silence. Thank you for your kind words, Robert. I am so humbled. Robert patted the back of Thomas's hand with a smile. I quickly looked away, but my mind kept replaying the scene over and over again uncontrollably. Folded hands, folded hands. His hands looked so warm. Colleagues reveled wildly, dancing like a madman, and advocating to drink and enjoy life today. I guess I just drank one glass after another just to fit in, and that's why I got a little drunk. Before leaving, Thomas called me and said, Robert is looking for you. He took me to a dark and deserted corridor. The next moment, he suddenly grabbed my tie, pushed me against the wall, pressed me tightly with his whole body, and kissed me roughly and violently. This time, even though I was kissing a man again, I didn't vomit or feel nauseous. Instead, the heart was beating violently, and the blood seemed to have all gathered somewhere. Let go. I'm disgusting and dark. But he didn't let me go. He whispered between kisses, I know everything. You don't need to tell me. He grinned, as if giving up on himself. You don't need to mention that you have a boyfriend anymore. I have no morals, no gratitude. I am just a wild dog that no one has taught me. If you want to kill me, you can let your black bean boyfriend kill me. If you don't kill me, I will keep pestering you. My hands, which had just been softened by his kiss, finally found some strength, and I pushed him away heavily. What are you doing? We are in Robert's house. Aren't you afraid of being seen by him? The image of those folded hands flashed through my mind again. Thomas wiped the corner of his mouth indifferently. It's okay. He observed my expression, and I dodged in embarrassment. Thomas suddenly said, I didn't sleep with him. He made me his adopted son because he found that I was more useful. He tapped his head gently. Robert is old and needs someone to help him do things. The title of adopted son is like giving me a computer password. I can handle official business with a name. Don't think too much about it. He was silent for a second, then held my sleeve and said, Daniel, you have to believe me. I whispered, I didn't say I didn't believe it. I didn't think much about it. He was just being too cautious and didn't want to leave any misunderstanding. He laughed. I finally couldn't help asking, "If you're unhappy, I can go and beg again." "No need, Daniel," he said calmly. "Just listen to me and don't go on the next delivery." He squeezed my shoulders and said solemnly, "Don't go." Of course I went anyway. I cannot be an outsider in the final crucial stage of closing the net. The delivery point was changed several times and finally to a small port. I drove the truck, slowly and carefully in the dark. The colleague did not realize that tonight would be an eventful one. He was fiddling with the car stereo with a cigarette in his mouth. His cell phone chimed softly. He looked at the screen and his expression suddenly changed. I also had a bad feeling and was about to stop the car when I heard a dangerous hissing sound. Oh no! Bang! A terrifying explosion sounded, and the fire wave almost overturned the truck. I put my gun away, picked up my phone, and quickly jumped out of the car. Not far away, sirens were heard. On the other end of the phone, John shouted, "No, this is not arranged by us. Is there another undercover agent in Robert's place?" I pursed my lips tightly, looking for a place to hide, while a guess already came to my mind. The sirens were getting louder and louder. "John, it's okay. I just told them about your identity. Don't worry." I breathed a sigh of relief, but suddenly someone grabbed my neck and dragged me into an alley. "Robert is dead." As soon as he started to speak, I stopped struggling. I asked, "Thomas, Robert is dead, and the rest of the people who should be arrested have been arrested, and those who should be killed have died." I frowned. "What happened? Are you okay?" The clouds dispersed and the moonlight shone brightly. I saw Thomas's expression clearly, strangely persistent and pale. He was overwhelmed by a huge and inexplicable sense of guilt, yet was held up by an extremely greedy desire. "The police will find this place soon and you will be arrested," he said softly and quickly. Thomas stood in front of me. His eyes were dark. "I have evidence of your crime. Daniel, as long as you promise me to break up and be with me, I will hide you well." I was annoyed. "Thomas, are you crazy? You can trade something like this. If you are guilty, you must confess. The law is long and wide, and nothing can escape it. When did this kid become like this? He was so crazy that he wanted to cover up other people's crimes. If I were a criminal, would he be in league with me?" Thomas said expressionlessly, "Yes, I am crazy. I am an ungrateful person. But, Daniel, I have no other choice. You are the only one I have. You are the only one who treats me well." He laughed miserably. "I like you. I only want you. You must hate the love of a madman. You look down on me. You despise me. I really have no other choice." He stopped smiling. His whole cold and handsome face, in the firelight, showed a desperate determination. "Daniel, promise me or I will send you to jail." I kept a cold face and didn't retreat a single step. Thomas softened his voice again and begged me, sounding so pitiful as if he was the one who was held capable. "Please, Daniel, promise me. Promise me. Okay? Hey, what are you doing?" A sharp cry woke Thomas up instantly, and he subconsciously stood in front of me. "He is not." Before he finished speaking, the police officers saw me. I sighed. "He's Thomas, the kidnapped victim. He's trustworthy." As soon as these words came out, I keenly felt that the person in front of me had stopped breathing, and he understood everything. The last hope was shattered in a ridiculous way, and the ugly plot was exposed. He has no leverage left. Thomas's back stiffened, and in the dead silence, his back slowly bent. It's as if he wants to hide himself in the mud. The police officers hurriedly greeted each other, did not make a fuss, and continued to clean up the mess. My mission is accomplished. There is no reason to stay any longer. However, I still hesitated and stood there for 2 more seconds. Just those 2 seconds for Thomas. I left in silence. From the alley entrance came the sound of painful crying, which became louder and louder, hysterical and full of regret. 3 years later, my record store business was pretty good, and I was lucky enough to have received several long-term orders. David and John visited me a few times. We all agreed on one thing: I can't be an undercover agent. If you have a strong conscience, you will always feel sorry for yourself. I was lucky that time, and Robert was a weak person, so his methods were not that cruel, so I was lucky to escape. After that incident, in order to prevent the remnants of the gang from recognizing me, I changed my name and stopped being a policeman. David comforted me. Look at the bright side. You don't have to pretend to be gay now, right? I wanted to say something but stopped myself. In fact, sometimes I can't figure things out myself, and I always fall into a state of confusion late at night. I always dream about Thomas, but I never once took the initiative to ask about his whereabouts. I think his almost desperate love for his lifeline will quickly disappear as life returns to normal. It's been 3 years. He should have forgotten who I am. David came to me again, but this time he was a little hesitant. Richard, there is something that may trouble you. However, you may be the most suitable person to do this. I asked what happened. Do you still remember Thomas? When we were closing the net, we accidentally ran into a gang fight. It was a big mess and many people died. That was no accident. I figured out a long time ago that it was Thomas who fanned the flames. David. Thomas then went abroad and only returned last week. We suspect he may know the whereabouts of several escaped criminals. Me, just asking a question? It's so simple, it seems like I don't even need to do it. David shook his head. It's not easy. Richard, you didn't know? He's a big shot now. David said. He is now the hottest focus at the financial summit and has a big company. We can't just call him to the police station casually. It will have a bad impact. I had no choice but to nod. David handed me an invitation to the dinner and asked me to find a chance to talk to him. When meeting old friends again, there is always an inexplicable complex emotion. I was standing in the corner of the banquet hall in my suit, sipping wine. There is even a sense of trance, as if I am in another world. Suddenly, all voices fell silent, and all eyes converged in one direction like the sea. Someone walked in quickly. I had only taken a few steps when I was surrounded by guests and started chatting with them. I stood by the wall, looking around silently. It's Thomas, but not like him. Although he used to be mature and gloomy, at least his words and actions inevitably carried a bit of the recklessness of youth. The man in front of him was polite, as if his face was wearing a mask that he would never take off. There was a gentle look in his eyes, and it was hard to imagine that such a noble man had such a background and had such an embarrassing and crying past. I hesitated and even hesitated to bring up the past that caused him the most pain. But Thomas actually came over on his own initiative. He smiled and held out his hand. Long time no see. It's as if nothing had ever happened between us. I was stunned for a moment and held his hand. Thomas didn't let go. He shook her and smiled. So your name is Richard. All invited guests have name cards. His eyes were deep. You always lie to me, Daniel. I pulled my hand back. Thomas held on tightly, whispered, and refused to give in. My boyfriend is fake. Everything is fake. Thomas. I didn't dare to say anything and scolded him in a low voice. I didn't understand why he knew so much about me. Could it be that he has been asking about me? But what is there for me, an ordinary man, to worry about? He clenched his teeth, with admiration and curiosity blooming behind him, and his eyes were red when he looked at me. Daniel, what is real? What is real about you and me? I lowered my head, my mind in a trance, and I said softly, at that time, I really loved you. Thomas stopped talking, and his cold expression suddenly disappeared. He pursed his lips, looked at me with red eyes, and said in a low voice, don't leave, wait until I finish my socializing. Turning around, there was that faint sense of fatigue of a successful elite again. Someone led me out through the side door of the hotel banquet hall, into the elevator, and to the room on the top floor which belonged to Thomas. While waiting, I smoked one cigarette after another, thinking about how I should start the conversation later. I thought about it for a long time, but still couldn't come up with a solution. But I saw the man turned back and told me softly, Richard, the thing you want, Thomas has been tracking down the whereabouts of other people abroad for the past 2 years, and now no one has escaped. I nodded. He asked me, Thomas, please do as you please. Please help yourself. Should I wait or not wait for him to come? After all the official matters between us have been resolved, I will still be willing to wait for him. If you wait, it means that what we are going to discuss next will all be private matters. I immediately understood his intention. This kid is still the same as he was back then, leaving no room for himself. I took a deep breath, lowered my head, and whispered, I'll wait for him. This time, it took only a few minutes for Thomas to push the door open. We looked at each other in silence. The rise and fall of his chest gradually became faster. Daniel, have you really thought it through? I spoke first. You may just be feeling a little bit of a baby bird complex, or you may be grateful to me. It's been 3 years, Daniel. I can't think about it for 3 years and still be so stupid. He was nervous and serious. I really like you as a person. Me, I am not a police officer now. I don't have that aura of justice. I know. Me, I'm not a gangster. I can't pretend to be a gangster anymore. I know that too. Daniel, you've never faked it before. Me, also, I might not be that gay. Thomas suddenly laughed. What do you mean? He clearly knew the answer. My face was a little hot, but I tried to suppress my expression. That's right. I only have feelings for you, a man. Thomas stared at me quietly. I know. He came closer and knelt on one knee in front of me where I was sitting. Daniel, I know everything. I like you and it has nothing to do with any of this. He gently placed his forehead on my palm. I'm just afraid that you will dislike me. I have a dark nature, corrupt morals, and extreme personality. Do you know that? Me, I know. I sighed. Then it seems that I can only keep a close eye on you and prevent you from doing anything stupid. He looked up suddenly and confirmed with me with a look of surprise and joy. I nodded. Thomas, let's try it. He looked at me intently, resting his hands on the armrests, and leaned forward to kiss me. Good. 11. It was the 3rd month that Thomas and I were dating. He opened a painting studio next to the record store. I was surprised. You can also draw. He smiled and said, As a doctor, you are very skillful. But even now, his original dream of becoming a doctor is no longer possible. He stared at me with a satisfied and helpless look on his face. Daniel, don't look at me with sympathy. Those things are all in the past. I scratched my head and smiled. David and his team closed the case smoothly. He forced me to go drinking with him and asked me heartlessly about the details of my relationship with Thomas. Brother, is he big? Me, rich man. I have never seen anyone richer than Thomas. I wish I could put my name on all the assets. Daniel is a man of loyalty and friendship. Even if one day you no longer like me, you will not break up with me in order to avoid dividing our assets and affecting the stock price of my company, he explained. I don't understand this business stuff, and I can't figure out whether what he said is true or he is lying to me. David then asked, Is Thomas also so gentle and distant in private? Me, no, not at all. This question is difficult to answer. Subconsciously, I thought of his extremely vigorous and brutal style in bed, as if he wanted to keep the two of us embedded together forever. Fortunately, I had a solid foundation from my early training, so I had a good physique and could endure the hardship, so I was able to bear it. I coughed a little and felt that the wine was a little too much. Outside the restaurant window, cars honked softly. I turned around and recognized that it was Thomas who came to pick me up. David, wow, bro, he loves it. I stood up and rubbed David's head. You talk too much. You've never been in love before, so you're just being infatuated. David seemed to be completely drunk. He lowered his head and said nothing. He just smiled foolishly. I wish you happiness. I walked out. Thomas opened the car door for me. Daniel, I miss you already. I sighed and kissed her skillfully and gently. Stupid.